Here we go.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I think this is take 4. We hope that you can see us and hear us. So excited that I finally have Jo Furniss on screen, and we're going to be talking today about her books and my books. We're going to be switching between us. So sometimes I'll be asking the questions. Sometimes she'll be asking the questions. I've introduced myself several times at this point. So I'm going to pass it over to Jo to introduce herself while I do a quick check to make sure that we're showing up in all the right places on the event.
Okay.
Jo, take it away.
Thank you. I got a big big thumbs up from my husband, Mark, who was the one that was kind of featuring quite heavily in your previous live. So I'm sorry to put you through that. For some reason, it wasn't working my end. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me onto your page. It's lovely to be here. I am the author of 3 novels. My latest is called The Last to Know, which is a contemporary novel, but with sort of quite gothic undertones, I suppose, and it's sort of set in the English countryside. So I think there's actually some parallels in a strange sort of way with your book. And previously I wrote 2 other novels, All the Little Children and The Trailing Spouse, which was set in Singapore, where I used to live.
Yes, and I have read 2 out of 3 of them. So I have my copy of All the Little Children here, and I actually just finished The Last to Know this week just gone, but I was reading it on Kindle, so I don't have a beautiful copy to show you in person, but I very much enjoyed it. And then hello again, everybody. I think a few of you watched our failed attempts to start this video before, but I'm Finola Austin. I write historical fiction, and my debut novel, Bronte's Mistress, came out in August from Atria Books. So the reason Jo and I know each other, and it's going to be my first question to Jo, is that we actually share an agent, the amazing Danielle Egan-Miller at Brown & Miller Literary Associates in Chicago. And I love stories of how people found their agents. But Jo has a particularly good story about how she and Danielle got in contact. So yes, let everyone know how you found Danielle, or she found you, Jo.
Yeah, well, we sort of found each other really in this moment of serendipity. So basically, you know, it was kind of the typical story for me, in as much as I'd written this book and I was sending it out to agents, and I'm English and my book is set in England, so I assumed that I would be pitching to agents in London, and I've been busy doing that. And then a friend of mine who's American, and she was pitching her novel to agents in the US, she spotted a tweet that with the hashtag MSWL, which I'll come back to in a minute, because at the point where my friend Melissa phoned me, and in this state of excitement, I didn't know what MSWL was, but she read this tweet out to me, and it said that there was an agent who was looking for a book, and I'm trying to remember, I'm hesitating because I'm trying to remember the exact wording of it. It was something like Mum Saves Her Family After a Disaster kind of novel. And the MSWL hashtag turned out to stand for manuscript wish list. So it's a hashtag that agents and sometimes editors put out when they're, you know, when they're in the market for something, when they've had an idea and they want to, you know, publish it. So, you know, if you're a writer out there that's thinking of sending out your book, it's really worth following that hashtag on Twitter. And actually there's a website as well for manuscript wish list, because that's a great place, obviously, to pick up where editors and agents are looking for books. So anyway, so my friend forwarded me this tweet, which said, you know, that Danielle was looking for Mum Saves Her Family After a Disaster. And I think I've got my first novel here, and the tagline for it is, when a family camping trip takes a dark turn, how far will one mother go to keep her family safe? So you can see that it couldn't have been more on the nose, this tweet. And I sort of replied same day, and I think I got a reply from Danielle the same day. And so after that usual kind of months and months of trying, all of a sudden we found each other, and that was how it happened. So it felt quite magical, really.
Yeah, it's a great story. And I love the story of Manuscript Wishlist as well, because it did just start as this hashtag on Twitter where just organically agents and editors started using it. And now there's a website. There's also a podcast. Danielle and I were on the podcast together telling the story of how we met. So she, I think, mentioned that she's had success signing clients. And I think you were top of mind, thanks to the hashtag itself.
Yeah, I think it might have been the first time, or one of the first times she'd ever sent it out,
wow.
when I picked up on it, or luckily my observant friend picked up on it. So what about you? How did you and Danielle come together?
Yeah, so Danielle, I found because we have very similar reading taste. So I was trawling the internet, looking at all the agents. I'm also from the UK. I'm half Irish, half English. Grew up in Northern Ireland, but I do live in the US. I'm here in Brooklyn, New York now. But I was pretty open-minded about where agents should be. So I was querying some agents in the UK and some in the US. My book is set in England because it's related to the Bronte sisters, so set in Yorkshire. But I didn't really know who I wanted to sign with. Danielle, I'd queried her before because we had similar taste. I think she mentioned the Brontes. I know she mentioned Daphne du Maurier as well. And every book she mentioned was either a book I already loved or one I'd been looking forward to reading, which I thought was a very good sign. But I thought I'd done my research very well. I sent the query email, and then I got an immediate automatic reply saying that it was actually August. It was August 2018, and saying that they were closed to queries. And I was mortified because I thought I caught everything, but I guess they tweeted that they were closed for the month to take a vacation month, and I totally missed that. And so I felt, oh no, what a terrible first impression. I guess I'll query again in a month or so when they're open. But within an hour, I got a response from Danielle directly saying, we're meant to be closed to queries actually for a month, but who could resist the story of the woman who seduced Branwell Bronte? And so it was that Bronte connection and our shared reading taste. So an incredible roller coaster to go from the depths of mortification to being so excited that she seemed excited. But then, of course, as any of you on the line who are writers know, there's a lot of waiting after that. So I didn't want to get my hopes too high or have it run away from me, but it really did feel like serendipity. Yeah. Tracy, I can see that you're joining us from Delaware. Thanks for coming. I'm excited for you to read Bronte's Mistress too. Anyone else who's watching, do put in the comments where you are. We'd love to hear. We put this at a time to get an international crowd because Joe's in the UK right now and I'm in the US. So we'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I can actually remember when you and Danielle first got in contact. I think I must have had a call with her around that time, and I remember her telling me about your book and how excited she was about it. And she was so excited about the whole the Bronte connection, and she was her sort of enthusiasm for it was really palpable.
And I think we exchanged emails as well because again, any of you writers online know that that's one of the questions you're meant to ask when an agent makes you an offer of representation is, can I talk to any of your current clients? So just to go separately to them and say, like, how's it been, the experience? And hearing, of course, Joe's great experience with Danielle is really comforting when you're about to make such a big decision.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to do that because I think sometimes you feel so much sort of on the back foot with these things. And generally, when if you're going through this process with agents, I mean, it's very rare to find someone straight away. I mean, everyone has rejections for all different reasons. And I think sometimes that means that when you get to the point where an agent makes you an offer, you almost feel like you should just take it, like just let me sign before you change your mind. But actually, I think it's quite important then to kind of slow down and just make sure that the relationship is there, because you do have to spend a lot of time, talking to your agent. I mean, hopefully you're going to be a team. And so I think, like you say, checking out, maybe chatting to some of their other clients and just checking out, their reputation and the way they work, even just make sure it's going to fit,
Yeah, and that's the thing I was going to ask you about. So obviously I've only had the one novel come out so far. I'm a debut. You're 3 books in, which probably means that in your head you're like 4 books in, because I'm sure you have something else in the works. Yeah, I think there's like a lot of emphasis if you go online about the first book or getting the agent versus what it's like on book 2 or 3 or beyond, and what that relationship is like after that. So any advice to people kind of earlier on like me who have just debuted, and how have you, like, people talk a lot about the debut and they talk about like a sophomore slump. How has that journey been for you since the publication of the first book?
It's a roller coaster, as you say. You're right. There's so much emphasis on the debut novel, And I think for a vast majority of writers, the debut is not necessarily actually the first thing they've written anyway. I mean, I've certainly got one whole novel, which is, you know, in a bottom drawer, and that's where it deserves to be. That's definitely
Yes.
staying. It's not coming out. You know, so most people, it's not the first novel anyway. And then I suppose I was quite fortunate in a way, because while I was sort of submitting, I kind of got on and wrote a second one. So at the point where I was kind of going out on submission to publishers, so I'd found Danielle, and then we were going out on submission. By then I had really two. I had the first book that was obviously quite polished, and I had a first draft of the second one. So it meant that she, she sort of pitched me as a possible 2-book deal, and that's actually what happened. So I didn't really have that sophomore slump so much, because the second one had already kind of come through, but I very much felt it then with the third one. Because, yeah, you've got all that kind of that expectation. I think you put a lot of pressure on yourself, because you feel like, well, I should know what I'm doing now. And I feel
yes.
like literally every time I start a novel, I find myself Googling, like, how do I write a book? And things like that. You know, it's like you're just starting all over again. So you have to deal with all of this. You have to deal with all of this stuff. But I think the nice thing is that the longer you're, you know, as you sort of start to get into the business, you start to meet other authors, and you realize that everyone is going through the same thing.
Yes. And I've got to say, so I have just written my third book. So I have a trunk book, like yours is not going to go anywhere. Then my debut, and I do have my next one, which is actually with our agent right now. But each time it kind of has felt similar for me. And I found some comfort in, I felt lost at 30,000 words last time. Whereas the first time it was also new. I didn't know what was normal. Was I doing something wrong? I think it's kind of like selective amnesia, right? Like I know that people talk about childbirth. You don't remember what it's like until you're going through it again. And I think maybe there's something similar with novel writing, where you're like, oh, right, yes, this was really challenging and really difficult, but I know that I got through this, which is a helpful thing for me to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's actually one of the, it's one of the very positive things, is that you start to almost like trust your process and sort of trust your own reaction. I mean, absolutely. As you say, I know that I get to about 40,000 words and I go into this massive slump of kind of thinking this is awful, and I'm awful. And what am I doing? I should just go and get a job. I mean, really, it comes on like quite strong. Yeah. And I have to, and you just have to kind of keep going. And I do this thing where I just have this quite little modest word count every day. And I literally have a little chart of boxes that sits on my wall. And every day with a highlighter pen, if I've written 1,250 words, I cross one of the little boxes off. And so I have to motivate myself with these kind of,
gamifying it.
I know, it's almost like my kids giving them like, a star chart, but, that motivates me strangely. And you just you trust it after a while. You're going to go through that, and then it's going to pick up. And once I'm past the first draft, I'm a lot happier.
Yeah, absolutely. It's getting to that ending. I'm just looking at the chat to see where else we have people coming from. We have more from Ireland and Whitehead, Istanbul. Wow. Thanks for coming, Irene. Calgary. And Tracy saying she wouldn't know where to start with writing a book. It all seems so overwhelming. It is overwhelming. I think that's what we're saying. And I don't think that'll go away for me, even if I reach book 10 or 12, right? Like it's always going to be tough. But she says she's going to stick with reading and reviewing them. And yeah, reading books is definitely a lot more fun sometimes.
Yeah, that's definitely good too. And Mariana, hello, Mariana in Florida.
Yeah.
And Harry's in New Jersey. It's great. Isn't it wonderful to have such an international
team? No, it's amazing to have people in. So we're obviously both had books come out recently. I know that while we were trying to get on and dealing with the tech, I spoke a little bit, but your book that just came out, The Lost to Know, I just read it, but I'm sure you can do a much better job than me describing it. Do you want to kind of tell people a little bit about what it's about?
Oh, sure. So The Last to Know is a psychological thriller, psychological suspense. It's about an American journalist called Rose who moves to a small village in the UK where her husband grew up. And when they get there, she discovers that him and his entire family are ostracized from the local community. I mean, they're hated. People, if they say their family name, they sort of whisper it, you know. And she didn't know any of this. And where his family live is in this quite sort of strange location in the UK. It's in a place called Shropshire, which is kind of in the Midlands over towards Wales, for people that don't know, you know, the English geography as well as I might do. And Shropshire is actually very famous for having hill forts, which are kind of quite ancient structures of where hills were kind of literally built up in prehistoric times to be like a defensive kind of structure. So they're very ancient, but there's loads of them around Shropshire. And in my book, there's a house that is built on top of one of these kind of hill forts. That's where the story kind of started for me, because I drove past one on a particularly misty morning and it looked really spooky. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be a great place for a novel to kind of end up there? And that's where the idea came from. So poor American Rose goes back to England. She moves into this dilapidated mansion on top of this hill with her husband, who is hated by the whole local community, and she has to kind of work it out from there.
Yeah, and I mean, I loved it. But what I think is interesting is on the surface, we write very different types of books, but there are some things that we share, which I think are favorite things of Danielle's, right? And spooky, slightly gothic mansions in the English countryside is absolutely one of those. I was interested in whether there was a particular hill fort or house in Shropshire that was the inspiration for this. You mentioned driving past one in particular. And then the other thing that stood out to me was this legend of the ghost, Mistress Payne. Is that a real Shropshire legend? It was amazing.
It's not real, but it's based on a very well-known Shropshire legend, who a woman called Madame Pigot. This is the real one. Madame Pigot haunts a particular kind of hill that is quite close to where I lived and where my in real life husband grew up. And yeah, I mean, people talk about Madame Pigot like it's just a fact, you know. Yeah, she haunts this hill and she makes people drive off the road when she's angry. And I wanted something sort of a bit like that, but that particular story didn't fit my narrative. So I kind of, based on that, I made up the story of Mistress Payne, who was a servant really in sort of medieval times, I suppose, who was abused by her employer, and then he threw her out of the house when she was pregnant, and her child obviously perished. And so she sort of haunts this, well, she haunts the whole community. But I guess what I was quite interested in with this ghost story was how your relationship to things changes quite rapidly. So at the beginning, obviously, you know, there's these ghostly sort of happenings quite early on in the novel, and obviously the main character Rose is quite frightened of what's happening. You know, it's spooky. There's some quite spooky stuff. But as things in the present time sort of degenerate in her life, so there's, you know, all these rumors about her husband, and then a body is found on the property. Suddenly, that her sort of fear of Mistress Payne kind of retreats into the background. It's almost like that's the least of my worries, this ghost that doesn't actually do anything worse than just open and close doors. I've got kind of a policeman knocking on my door. So I quite enjoyed sort of playing with that, of how things that seem very spooky, you kind of get used to quite quickly, and they all sort of adjust to Mistress Payne quite quickly. And I think by the end of the book, it's not even clear whether she's sort of, you know, a benevolent or vindictive ghost. It's, you know, they sort of accepted her into the family, really.
I love that. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I think what struck me is, obviously, Rose is an American character coming to live in England, and something I've been thinking about is how history feels so much closer in England. When I was doing research for Bronte's Mistress, I found that very true. I went to the area in Yorkshire where my story Bronte's Mistress is set, and where Lydia Robinson lived around Little and Great Ousburn. And people were able to tell me things, oral history about the 1840s. And here in the US, if you mention the 1840s, it seems a very long time ago. Whereas to me, the 1840s is just out of reach. And so the idea of a medieval ghost just being accepted as part of the family strikes me as kind of quintessentially British in some way, just being comfortable of living with the past right around us.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the other thing that sort of inspired that was actually when I was growing up, though, I had a friend, sort of a friend of a friend, but he was in my kind of group, a guy called John. And he always talked about how as a younger kid, his house was haunted. And his mum used to basically name all the ghosts to make them seem less frightening for the kids. So they would, they'd be sitting in the kitchen and the door on one side of the room would open and close, and then the door on the other side of the room would open and close, as though someone had walked through, but obviously there was no one there. And this used to happen in all the different rooms in his house. And so they just, again, they just named all the ghosts to make it seem less frightening. And that always kind of stuck with me. And it ended up, these little things that you kind of gather through your life, they sort of pop up, don't they, really, when you're writing. But you mentioned there about going to on your research trip, and it was one of the questions I really wanted to ask you, was whether there was any, because obviously the Brontes, it's such a well-known family, it's like legendary, was there any kind of resistance to you writing this story? I mean, do people sort of feel an ownership to it in that area in Yorkshire?
Yeah, this was actually something I was pretty concerned about. So my book is about Lydia Robinson, who is this older woman rumored to have had an affair with Branwell Bronte, the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, their brother. And she really has been painted as the villain of the piece through history. So starting with the first biography from Elizabeth Gaskell, fellow Victorian novelist and friend of Charlotte, who calls her this wretched and profligate woman who tempted Branwell into the deep disgrace of a deadly sin. And really a lot of Bronte fans and scholars have taken their cue from Mrs. Gaskell. So in their depiction of Lydia, they've always had her as this almost pantomime-ish villain. And even adaptations of the Brontes' lives that have sought to kind of go up against some of what Mrs. Gaskell said about other parts of the family have still been very accepting of this. So even the BBC's To Walk Invisible, they have flashbacks of Lydia where she's cackling like a witch in a Disney film, rather than having any nuance. So I knew that by taking her story, and I definitely don't depict her as an angel, right? Like, she's very flawed, but I do take her perspective. The book is in her point of view. I was worried about alienating Bronte fans, even though I am very much one myself. And Lydia doesn't always like the Bronte sisters, especially Anne Bronte, who is governess in her house. There's some tension between the pair of them, as I think there often might be, between the mistress of the house and the governess, who's spending most of her time looking after her teenage daughters. And so I wanted to be clear to people that Lydia's views are not my views, and I am not Lydia. And I like the Bronte sisters, including Anne. But actually, I've been really pleased by the response. I did a full year of research before I started writing. And then once I had a draft, I did go to Yorkshire. So my research was very substantial. I think I've read every journal article and academic book ever written that kind of goes into Lydia Robinson in a lot of depth. So I was really well schooled in the scholarship about it. And in the back of my book, I have a long author's note that kind of lays out what's true and what's not. So I think even when people might disagree or have their own interpretations, a lot of Bronte fans and scholars just want to know that you've done your homework, right? That you've read the books, that you've put in the time, because there are real Bronte fanatics out there. There's not as many as there are for Jane Austen, for example, but the ones who are there are really dedicated. Yeah. I did a blog tour, and that included with Bronte blog. That's probably the home of the Bronte fandom online. And I got a good review from them, which meant a lot for me. I think the only thing they caught is potentially I got the sex of the dog wrong, but that is mixed in Bronte scholarship. So the dog Flossie, around half of scholars have presumed that Flossie was female, and I defaulted to that because the first reference I found was female dog. But actually it seems like Flossie may have been male. So I apologize for that. But if that's the thing they're going to pick on, then I'm pretty happy that the rest of it was, if that's
legit. The worst of it, then you seem to be doing pretty well. So that was kind of the official thumbs up. So obviously you've done so much research. Did you do that because you're just naturally an academic and you're genuinely interested, or did you almost feel like you had to sort of protect yourself a little bit, like you had to establish those credentials?
Both. So I have a master's in 19th century literature. So my approach to the period is already pretty academic, though one of the things about writing novels is you turn something academic into something much more accessible. So I certainly don't think you need to know anything about the Victorian period or even have read any of the Brontes in order to enjoy the book. And that's been my favorite, is to have reviews from people saying, oh, I'm going to go and read Jane Eyre now and Wuthering Heights, because I think they're such great books. And I'm delighted that I'm inspiring people to go and read them. One thing is that the research actually helps my process. So we talked about how overwhelming and daunting writing a book can be. I find it less daunting if I have some facts that can start to form the basis of my outline. So I essentially started with a spreadsheet of all known events in the Bronte sisters and Lydia Robinson's life, and then kind of worked out where my beginning and ending were, and then started to fill in the gaps and say, well, if this is going to happen by this date, what must have happened between, and how can I come up with the most dramatic and exciting story with the facts at our disposal? So it kind of felt like having a co-writer. And with the next book that I'm working on, it feels similar. The co-writer gives me some immovable points in time where you can't change that this person died, or this major event happened on this date, or they got married on this date, but everything else is up for grabs. And there is something interesting that happens when you research, that it almost feels like discovery or detective work. And sometimes you get hunches that are then confirmed by your research, which feels almost prescient, like, oh, wow, I guessed ahead of time that this was going to be the fact. So some historical novelists get almost mystical about this. I'm not one of those. New York sirens. Yeah, I don't believe that, you know, Lydia visited me in a dream, or I was anybody in the book in a previous life, or that their ghosts are surrounding me. But I understand why people might get that feeling, because you feel very close into the history, and it almost feels like it serves up gifts to you, or plot problems are solved by a combination of your facts and your own imagination.
I don't mean to be unromantic, but is it not that you've immersed yourself in it so much that you get to the point where you are, you know, if you're feeling it, you know, you can sort of predict things, or you just kind of, you get to the stage where you kind of know how people are going to.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's very hard for me, though, after some time I can, because I keep notes, so I can say, well, this is true and this is what I made up, but they all become so blended and merged together that sometimes it's like, for instance, I have a horrible mother-in-law character, and I made her horrible because there was one line in a letter that survived that said, Grandmama was exceedingly angry. And so I took that as the kernel of what if there was this bad relationship between Lydia and her mother-in-law. And so it was based on a truth and a fact, but a very minor one that I spun into something bigger. And I guess I take the hints that history leaves us. Hilary Mantel talks about, can these bones live, as the question she asks herself when researching people in the past. And I think that's what you're doing. You're kind of reanimating the corpses. And are there enough of those little details that can help you bring them to life? Is kind of the question that I'm asking myself.
Yeah, I love the serendipity of these. As you say, I've actually just, during lockdown, really, I wrote a manuscript for a novel, which, if you know, if it's a goer, it would be my first historical novel set in 1899, and it's set around a school, a girls' school, a real school. And there was just what you were saying about the sort of the little detail that just brought to mind that there was a character, like quite a minor character, that I was writing at this school, and I was thinking that maybe she would be dyslexic, and I was suddenly sort of went down this little rabbit hole of thinking, well, you know, were the people kind of aware of dyslexia in 1899? What would have been, you know? So off I go, kind of into the research. I live in a town called Brighton, which is on the south coast of the UK, and it turned out that in the 1890s, the sort of one of the world's expert on dyslexia, which wasn't called dyslexia back then, lived in the next town. So I'd had this idea that, you know, that something to do with this character. And so suddenly it just made complete sense that within the world of my novel, it was possible that she had actually been to see this guy and was, you know, and was kind of diagnosed, because he'd starting to diagnose people. you know, and what are the chances? What are the chances that he would be 5 miles down the road, which is, you know, obviously a perfect horse carriage ride away?
Yes, that's a perfect example. I have one too in Bronte's Mistress, where I really wanted Branwell and Lydia to be in the same place, but the timeline put one of them in Scarborough while one of them was near Great and Little Ousben. And then I discovered that the railway line, new railway line between York and Scarborough, not only had it opened that weekend, but they had a big opening, and the party train went from York after the champagne breakfast to Scarborough. And I suddenly had this really cool image of the train with all these people who were celebrating, and a way to get them between these two locations at a really pivotal time. And Branwell had previously worked for the railway. It was kind of highly plausible that this could be an event that he might actually be at. And I found some academics even who had posited that he might have been there because one of his former associates, a person called Grouch, they believe was on the guest list. And so from me going, what am I going to do with this plot problem of two people in two different towns? Now, I don't know if I really believe he was on the train, but I really believe he could have been on the train. Yeah, which is great.
That's amazing. That's amazing. One thing I also wanted to ask you about Bronte's Mistress is that I noticed the dedication at the front was to, again, I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me, but it was to women who didn't write their novels.
Yeah, to the women who didn't write their novels. I'll show people.
There we go.
Yeah.
I love that. But it feels quite pointed. And I wondered what was your thinking behind that?
Yeah, a few things. I had the dedication very early, and I will say that I did not include it when I was querying agents because I thought it was too presumptuous to have the dedication there, because it looked like I was saying, I'm definitely going to get published. But I did have it from even before I'd finished writing the novel. Wow. In fact, adding that page was something I only let myself do when I had the completed manuscript as a kind of, well done you get to write this. Like some people might type the end in celebration. I think that the dedication is really incredible real estate from a marketing standpoint in a book. It's so early on the first few pages, and I think it's a time you can be really pointed and kind of leave an authorial mark, because the dedication kind of plays a dual role. It introduces you to the tone of the book, but at the same time, it is personal. A lot of people dedicate their book to their partner or to their parents or to their children, someone who means a lot to them. And so I think it's a time where authorial intrusion feels more appropriate than if you're like ham-fisted and heavy-handed with being didactic in the book itself. Yeah. So those are some of the things I was thinking about. I guess there's a dual meaning to it, where there's a lot of women in the 19th century who didn't get to write their books. The Brontes, incredible as they were definitely the exception to the rule. And I think it's really tragic that there's so many people who maybe didn't write because they didn't even think their stories were worth sharing, or they didn't think that their opinions mattered. And Lydia Robinson, I think, is one of those people to me, where history has very much judged her, especially for being an adulteress, right, or a rumored adulteress. And this is at a time where it's not like she could get a divorce. So I understand where people are upset about characters in contemporary fiction who commit adultery, right? Because they can always say, why don't they just leave? Yeah. But in the 1840s, that's substantially harder. And so for someone's entire legacy to be this, I think, very gendered double standard where she's blamed for Bramwell's demise really felt wrong to me. So partly it's for her and other women like her. Partly I think it's also, though, for women now who don't write their novels or haven't written them and maybe still feel some of that. My voice doesn't matter. My own creative pursuits don't matter. And I still believe that, you know, it's been over 100 years since Virginia Woolf was talking about the importance of women having a room of their own. I still think that women maybe more than men struggle with that. The idea that I should have space to create and create something for me, and it can be seen as selfish, and is more often seen as selfish for women to do that. So I guess it was there as a kind of a plea to any woman out there who feel like that, like, I want to hear your stories. I want to hear what you have to say. And even if it is unpleasant, like Lydia, as I say, is a very flawed human being. She's not always nice. She's not always likable. But I think that expressing those feelings matters too.
I have to say, I mean, sometimes that quote from Virginia Woolf about the women of one's own kind of almost makes me smile, because I kind of think, you know what, a room is the least of it. I mean, with all respect to Virginia Woolf, who obviously I hold in very high esteem, but you know, I think you made a point in a piece that you wrote that, you know, Virginia Woolf didn't have children, and a lot of the successful female novelists in history didn't have children, and so that does give them the space to write. Yes. In other words, the time space. I mean, that's the thing I think that is, you know, most noticeable, and you know, and still. And it was an interesting thing reading your book, because there were many points where I sort of thought to myself, like, oh, I wonder how Lydia Robinson would fare today. And in actual fact, without being too cynical, I think that quite a lot of the problems she faced probably wouldn't be that much different today.
Yes. That's how I felt too. Like, people ask me that question and I'm like, well, there are still plenty of people like Lydia, right? Like, some of the, you know, they'd be wearing different clothes. But even her feeling that for a woman to earn her own living is like the worst thing possible, like, there are still people who feel that, or feel that they should be supported, or don't see their role as being the breadwinner, or their sense of status is so tied to their marriage and having the perfect life that even if they are unhappy, it's difficult for them to leave. And yeah, in another event, I was talking about how Victorian period is kind of easy for us to understand, because we know people today who maybe still hold some of the same values and have some of the same feelings. So I think that's true. I was going to ask about motherhood in your book as well. I mean, I'm not a parent, and I had people question Lydia's parenting choices a lot, even though she's a woman from the 1840s where to parent wasn't even a verb at that point. They had very different attitudes about it. I think for her time, she's not a bad parent. She's involved. She doesn't beat her children. She definitely believes in tough love, because she's trying to get her daughters to marry well, and that includes staying thin and being attractive to men. But I've kind of had a preview of what they might call here mommy judgment, right? Where people saying, well, an awful woman because she's not a good parent. And in your books, and you write about mothers as well, right? And have you felt that same critique? Do people come back and say, well, why isn't Rose like looking after Aled right now? Or in All the Little Children, there's a moment where she loses one of her children, right, in the supermarket, in this post-apocalyptic situation. Have people been harsh judges of your women characters, especially when it comes to parenting?
The answer to that, well, certainly for All the Little Children, is yes. I mean, so All the Little Children, as you said, it's a kind of post-apocalyptic, it's actually about a pandemic, believe it or not. And yeah, it's kind of post-apocalyptic, and it's about this mom and her 3 children and a whole bunch of other children who she has to kind of look after in this kind of survival situation. And where that book kind of came from was that I wrote it quite soon after having my kids, and I was quite shocked really at how much kind of public discourse there is, how much public judgment there is of mothers, in the sense that you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. You know, if you go back to work, you're accused of sort of, you know, not prioritizing your family. And if you stay home, then you're accused of being a bad feminist, or not, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, you can't win, basically. And so I kind of put this all into the character of Marlena, the main character, and I purposefully set out to write the sort of character that, you know, the sort of certain type of media outlets would kind of hate, because she's a very successful businesswoman. She has 3 children, and she does everything that she possibly can for them. But, you know, she's not kind of cupcakes and cuddles, really. She finds it quite hard to be maternal. And I mean, it was a very provocative book in that respect. I was definitely poking the hornet's nest. And yeah, some of them flew out. But I mean, there were also a lot of people who I think genuinely responded to having a different portrayal of motherhood and mothers. Yeah. And, you know, and a depiction of a woman who just keeps fighting. She keeps fighting for her kids, whatever it takes.
Which I think that is maternal, right? Like, that's what's so interesting to me. You say she struggles to be maternal, but I think that core of that book is the maternal instinct of protection, right? And sometimes that involves putting your own children ahead of other people's children, which is that same kind of ruthless streak we see in Lydia too, right? Like, it's not, Yeah, like come, you know, for cupcakes, as you say, but it's kind of like, I'm going to teach you how to survive in the world, and you might hate me while I'm doing it, but that's my job as a mother. And there is this moment where Anne Bronte, Lydia says to her, like, it's all very well for you to coddle the children, but you don't love them as much as I do. And it's not a mother's job to coddle. It's a mother's job to be realistic and to prepare her children, especially her daughters, for these harsh realities. When you're talking about some of the hornets flying out, do you mean readers, reviewers, both? Do you think the judgment comes from women, from men? Where is the judgment coming from? All sides?
Women, actually. I have to be honest. I mean, I think generally speaking, we have a very set idea in society nowadays of what, you know, what a mother is, what a mother looks like, and how they sort of, you know, behave. And if you sort of waver from that, it's not really very accepted. I mean, reviewers generally, as informal reviewers, were supportive, and a vast majority of readers were as well, even if they sort of found the character prickly, and she is prickly. I mean, I did it on purpose, you know, she's not accidentally prickly. She's not the easiest woman, but what I hope is that, you know, obviously she almost comes to accept her emotional side, I suppose. By the end of it, she comes to accept that she's good enough, that she's doing enough. And, you know, and some people really responded well to that. But no, I had some quite, honestly, between us, I had some quite sort of, you know, vitriolic comments, really. Some people get very impassioned about it.
They really do.
There's something about motherhood that makes people feel that they have the right to be quite personal. I mean, I did get a few sort of personal emails asking, you know, I hope you don't have children, which I do. You know, so it is that sort of area where people can get quite vitriolic.
Yes, I had an interesting preview of that even way prior to the book coming out or even being finished. I was in a class and the book was not completed. It was like the first chapter or so. And when I got to the class, and one of my fellow classmates on historical fiction saw how young I was, the first thing she asked me was, "Are you a parent?" And then she basically was like, "You can tell you're not a parent. No mother would act this way. You don't have the right to write this book." And it was an extremely personal attack. And this was, you know, a class for people who were drafting, who were meant to be supportive. And it gave me that preview of, yeah, the can of worms that I think has been most dangerous to open has not been the Bronte one that we started off talking about. It's actually writing motherhood, I think, has been scarier than writing about people like the Brontes who are super famous. Yeah. And on that, I realized that people have asked me so many questions about Lydia as a mother, but nobody asked me about Edmund, her husband, as a father at all. And he's so absent. He tells the kids to be quiet once, but otherwise he's really not involved. But all the critique went straight her way. And in your latest book, The Last to Know, there is a moment where the father, the husband, is so distracted that there's the danger that the little boy might get run over by a car, right? And I did wonder if that had been Rose who got distracted. Would that have been death unto her from reviewers and readers as a character, whereas he kind of gets away with it a little bit?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, you know, it's amazing that we can be, you know, what, 150, 170 years later, and still that kind of that sort of sense that the kids are entirely the responsibility really of the female domain is still just accepted. Yeah, and there's quite a bit in The Last to Know about the sort of the balance of sharing. So the setup is that the main character Rose and her English husband Dylan, that they had met and married when they lived overseas. I've spent a lot of my life living overseas, and that seems to be something I can't stop it coming into the books. I keep writing characters who have been expatriates like me, but they met and married and had their child when they were living abroad, and so they'd always. When you live that life, you very often have help in the house. And they had, you know, a nanny basically. And then they move back to the UK. They don't have the nanny anymore. Suddenly they've got to kind of negotiate, sharing. They both want to work, and they move back with this very sort of idealized version of how it was going to look. And as soon as the sort of, you know, things get a little bit difficult, they sort of revert back to tradition, really. And I suppose I was playing a little bit of a game as well with Dylan, because one of the things I was quite interested in actually was, so in the book, Dylan moves back to the village where he grew up, but he hasn't lived there for 20 years. And I was quite interested in how much people, when you go home, how much you almost revert back to what you used to be, whatever Absolutely. Whatever you've done in the meantime, however you've matured and developed and changed, there's something about going back home. It's almost like the people there won't let you be the new person that you've become. You have to sort of go back to being the old person that you were.
Especially when his old high school girlfriend is around, right? Like, yeah. I love the nicknames that they used and the teenage dramas that maybe he hasn't thought about for years suddenly come back to the fore when you're back in your hometown. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is why I dug into the nicknames quite heavily. So everyone in the book, apart from really Rose, the main character, has got a nickname, which is, you know, it's a label, isn't it? People get labeled. And sometimes these nicknames can come from some really random little incident that happened when you were, you know, 17 or something, and you get stuck with it for the rest of your life. Like, you can never move away from it. You can never live it down. And so, yeah, I kind of populated the book with people who do have these sort of nicknames. And it's like a private language. You know, for Rose, the American journalist, when she moves back into that sort of little community, she can't speak the language. She doesn't know what they're all talking about, because they're all talking about people who, you know, their names are bizarre. They don't make any sense to her, and she can't. It's another sort of barrier to stop her sort of getting into that community.
Yeah, it struck me as well that when they were both abroad, so they were in Africa, right, previously, they were both outsiders, but then they go to this situation where she's the only one who's the outsider. I can see in the chat we're actually getting some questions about expatriate things. So Tracy asked, why did I move to New York? And was it a difficult adjustment? And I actually moved for my day job, but I work in advertising. So I've moved here 6 years ago. And when I came, it was only meant to be for a year, but it's been 6. And now I'm considering the move pretty permanent. I'm a permanent resident now. But it's interesting because how difficult was it for you to adjust? I wish I'd written more of it down, because it becomes so normal. And the things that really were hard, like, you just adapt to. So I remember that the first few weeks were incredibly difficult, just logistically, because when you don't have like a bank account, a social security number, a phone, like, everything is dependent on everything else. But of course, once that's all out of the way, it is the smaller stuff, the not really understanding, not what people are saying, because I moved to somewhere where they speak English here as well, you know, just dropping a few U's. But you didn't really know what they mean or what they meant. And now I have more of the reverse, where I feel some of the reverse culture shock when I'm back in the UK. Jo, as you mentioned, you've lived abroad, various places. Was that for your career as a journalist or your husband's career? And how was the adjustment for you each time?
Well, I mean, my husband was definitely the lead job. He is in the coffee industry, so his job has taken us to, you know, some interesting places. I was working as a journalist and then obviously a writer, so that was great because it's a job that I could take with me. But I did a very similar thing to you. I was working at the BBC and I took a 1-year sabbatical to go and live in Cameroon in West Africa. And we ended up being there for 2 years, and then Singapore for 2 years, and then Switzerland for 7 years, and then back to Singapore for another 5 years. And then we just quite recently moved home. And it's a bit like you were saying, really, we were saying earlier about the novels, like, you start to understand the process of it after a while. And I've noticed that there's a distinct pattern that if you relocate to a place, the first couple of weeks feels a bit like a holiday. So it's very exciting because you're basically in holiday mode. And then you sort of, after about 6 weeks, that kind of wears off and you start to get this horrible feeling of like, oh gosh, this is actually my life now. And then I think then you quite often can go through a bit of a low time, really, up until about 3 months. And then I always find at about 3 months in, I meet someone who's newer than I am. Like someone
yeah, that helps.
And then suddenly you can adopt them. You suddenly kind of go, oh gosh, and it makes you realize how much you've learned, how much you've found out, and all the kind of tricks, and you can sort of put your arm around that person and go, come on, I'll show you the ropes. And you take them, and like you say, you help them go and get their phone, and you go and sort out their, you know, show them where they're going to buy their, I don't know what, table, their crockery for the table or something like this, you know. And suddenly you have this slight sense that you've, you know, of belonging, and then it's okay. But that seems to have happened at every move that I've made, and I've sort of grown to trust it. Really, you know, you're going to have a bit of a slump, but you'll kind of come back up out of it.
Yeah, new expats, visitors are good as well, because visitors from the UK remind me of the things that I used to think were weird about America, and now I've kind of got used to them. So whether it's like, you know, adding the tax after you're paying in the restaurant, or like the way people behave at baseball stadiums, or whatever it is, like now I'm just kind of used to that. But having that outsider come in, the visitor with me, makes me recall what it was like when I was seeing through their eyes.
Sometimes it's the most mundane things as well that can totally derail you. So I was in, like I say, I was in Cameroon for 2 years, and then Singapore for 2 years, and then we moved back to Switzerland. And I think I felt, because I was coming back to Europe, that it was going to be easier, that it was going to be all more familiar, you know, and this would be a breeze now that I'm in Switzerland. Obviously, the fact that I didn't speak any German and I was in the German-speaking part didn't sort of occur to me. But anyway, literally the first day we were there, I went to the supermarket, and once I had the, like, all of my, you know, new purchases kind of lined up on the conveyor belt, I discovered that they don't take credit cards in supermarkets in Switzerland, and they don't give you bags. And so I had to just kind of abandon everything there and go, I have these two problems. And you did, like, it was so weird. And it kind of freaked me out so much, because you just think, gosh, I can't even go to the supermarket. It seemed very odd. But
you feel totally inept. One of the biggest things I remember was the first few times I took taxis, I didn't know how to give addresses to taxi drivers in New York. So you have to give the cross street. You have to be like, oh, I'm going to 5th and 36th. But I didn't know. I was giving exact addresses. And often the taxi drivers' English was not their first language, and it is my first language. And yet they were talking to me super slowly, as if I couldn't speak English, or as if I wasn't smart, because they didn't understand what I was saying and they thought I didn't know where I was going. And that was so disorientating to realize that I didn't know how to speak the language here. Of course, nowadays everyone just Ubers everywhere, so that particular social awkwardness is gone.
Yeah, I think in Switzerland now you're safe. You can use your credit cards. I think that's come on as well. So you know, yeah, very much of its time. I think Tracy needs to go traveling, because she's keen to go to all these places we've been mentioning.
Yes, Tracy. Yes, please do. And you should definitely go to England first, I think, because that's our unifying thing. And check out Yorkshire and go visit the Bronte parsonage. So know that you're into the book. Yes. So I was going to ask as well, I noticed from your website that you actually work with writers, so give advice to people, and that's something that you're doing now. What's kind of like the #1 tips that you give writers, or the #1 mistakes that you see amateur writers making?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's something I'm doing. It's very new, actually. Last year I ran sort of workshops and things for a while, and last year I taught on the Avon Foundation course, which here in the UK is quite a well established creative writing organisation. And yeah, so what mistakes you make? I think the main thing is generally people not writing. It sounds like ridiculous, but people kind of worrying about it so much that they don't actually get many words down. So one of the things that I'm hoping, you know, I do a little bit with the kind of mentoring is really kind of say, just keep sending me stuff, just write, because unless you kind of get words down, it's like the clay, isn't it? It's the clay that you're then going to play with later. Unless you've got some things down on the page, there's nothing, you know, that you can do with it. And it's like we were saying earlier, you know, a book is overwhelming. And so you just have to start. And it will be rubbish. I mean, let's all be honest. A first draft is always rubbish. It doesn't matter how, I don't think really, it doesn't matter how experienced you are. But it's supposed to be. And, you know, the best part of writing really is editing. It's all in the editing. And I think, you know, I can sort of go back to my experience, because the first book that I wrote, the one that I, you know, sort of put in the bottom drawer, like I said earlier, I think the biggest mistake I made with that was thinking that the first draft was it. Because I literally wrote a draft, printed it out and put it in an envelope and sent it to Random House. That was it.
How did that go for you?
Yeah, not too well. Not too well. I think I have this fantasy, because this is what happens in sort of, you know, films and things, is that you have this,
and they do a montage to speed it up as well. It's great. I'm like, if I could go into montage mode and be like, okay, 6 months later, there you go, book done, it would be so much easier.
Sometimes it's even overnight in film. You know, you're there and they'll have a typewriter and they'll tap, 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 and they'll get the piece of paper and they'll whip it out and go, no, that's terrible. And they think about it, and then they go tap, 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 and they go, no, that's terrible. And then you cut away and you come back and there's a big pile of paper that, you know, they're all terrible. And all of a sudden they go bing and they write it, and then overnight it's done. And, you know, spoiler alert, but that's just not how it works. I mean, any book that's out there actually on the shelf has been edited. You forget how many times it's been through so many people's hands. So I think that, you know, the main sort of tip that I give is just to write forward. You know, don't write something and then keep going over it and over it and over it and finessing it. Just write forward, and then worry about the next stage later.
Yeah, I think movies have a lot to answer for. One, about the depiction of writers, but I think my answer to this about mistakes, I agree with you about people just not writing, but I actually think people trying to write as if they were writing out a movie that's in their head can be a big problem as well, because books are different from movies and they can do different things. And sometimes you can tell when someone's writing that they're envisaging a movie or a TV show and what the camera shots would be like, whereas books typically are written as if the camera is inside your main character's head versus you're seeing everybody on screen. I mean, obviously there are different perspectives and point of views you can take, but that's typically what we see with current modern fiction. And so thinking about writing as if you're writing out a movie is something that I think can really hold people up as well. And I even see it with they'll start with the wide establishing shot and then zoom in on the action. And I think it's being more familiar with that medium versus with the medium of writing books.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's great advice as well. Yeah, it's you know, it's hard to get started, but I think it's a really exciting place to be. And I like, you know, working with people. The Arvon course that I taught was entirely beginning writers, you know, and to sort of see somebody kind of almost find the little thread that they want to develop is really exciting. So I like doing that. I want to ask you a question, going back a little bit to Bronte's Mistress. And I want to ask you a question for a slightly self-serving reason, actually, because the manuscript that I've just written, I mentioned before, is set in 1899 around a girls' school, and it features a couple of women. They're not the main characters, but they're very much in the story, who are real people. And I wondered about, you know, sort of whether you felt responsibility for that kind of the sort of the reputation, but also how you sort of factored that into the narrative, those real, the real people.
Yeah. Well, everyone in Bronte's Mistress is real. So not just the famous ones, not just the Brontes or Lydia. So every servant who's mentioned, every neighbor who's mentioned, the dog, as I mentioned, though not sure how the dog would identify gender-wise. So I did feel a responsibility, but in the same way I felt a responsibility to the facts and to the Bronte's legacy. I think it's long enough ago that it's not like you're going to be upsetting anybody's children or even grandchildren. I think it's different if you're writing about someone who definitely is still alive or within living memory. I think that's another thing to think about. And I haven't written a project that was like that yet, and I don't think I ever will. But yeah, I think that kind of went into why I did so much research, especially with the servant characters and the neighbors and everyone. I really wanted to do them justice too. I didn't want it just to be like footman number 2. Like I wanted the servants to have real backstories that I understood. And I felt close to them from learning about their families and their circumstances and how many children they had and how many of those children had died young. And even when the facts didn't make it into the novel, it gave me a lot of respect for them as people.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, though, what people think is disrespectful sometimes is more revealing about they themselves. Not in this book. Well, in this book, I do have a character who we might describe as gay, but this wasn't about him. It was about my next book, actually. And someone said, how can you accuse people in the past of being gay? And I first thought that was so interesting because it just revealed that that person thought that it was an accusation to say that someone was gay, and that would be a negative thing. So I was like, oh, wow. Like, I don't really think this is a slur or like defamation to suggest that this might have been the case.
No. But I suppose we always see the past sort of with our, with our own filter. And I suppose I'm very conscious a little bit of sort of overwriting my kind of feminist point of view onto this era and onto these women, and sort of making assumptions about, because the women I'm writing about, I think they might not have used the word feminist in 1890. I think the word had sort of just started to be used, but they might not have used it. But I think they definitely were feminists because they were promoting education for women, like proper education for women. But I don't want to sort of overwrite my understanding and my concerns of feminism onto them.
Yes, well, I think a few things can help here. I think the more you immerse yourself in the period, you can kind of adopt their language. So just reading what like reformers around women's education are saying in the 1890s, you start to understand how they think. Talking to experts too. I actually, I know someone who, I don't want to volunteer her, but you might want to talk to, because she's actually a historian that specializes in education and going co-ed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But speaking to people like that, who'll be able to kind of tell you where you're on track and where you're off piece. And I've done that with people who are queer historians as well, to make sure that the terminology I'm using and the mindset I'm giving people is kind of correct, or I'm not putting my own views on. And then the other thing I would say is making sure that you don't agree with everything, or giving the character some views you don't hold. So Lydia, I don't think is a feminist, or she's definitely a bad feminist. So I have some moments, for instance, where she talks about, how she's delighted at manumission and the end of slavery, but she's doing it in order to impress someone at a dinner party. So nowadays we might say she was virtue signaling. There are other times where she says stuff that I absolutely disagree with. So I like the idea of making characters progressive in some ways and backwards in others. The glib way I say this is you can have someone who's a suffragette, but maybe they're a racist suffragette. It doesn't always need to be like that. But think about like, what are the things they can be wrong about? And not in the very heavy-handed way. Like I think about the play and Inspector Calls, where there's a character who says, the Titanic will never sink. Yeah, and that for me is the really heavy-handed way to do it in historical fiction. But you can have people be wrong about their predictions of what's going to happen to the society or the future, or what the world would be like, say, if women got the vote, etc.
Yeah. And how do you think Lydia Robinson then, Mrs. Robinson, how do you think if she were alive now, do you think she would be a totally different woman?
I think that people are so much a product of their time and how they grew up. And like, she has been trained for this. I think that she's done everything right. There's this passage where she talks about how Christianity was something she was just good at, like talking nicely to the grown-ups and crossing her ankles when she was sat down so as not to flash her underwear. And I think there are so many people who just do what society expects of them and go through the motions. And then maybe they reach a point in their life where they're like, well, that's it. That's my reward. I did all of this stuff. And where did it get me? Or maybe it got me to a place I wouldn't want to be. So I don't know exactly what Lydia's life would be like. I think, though, that she'd be the kind of person who would follow the path that had been set out from her by her parents. And maybe that would be a different path today. Maybe she'd find herself being a lawyer who didn't want to be a lawyer and had that revelation later. Maybe she still would want to not work, and kind of look down on women who do, but at the same time be kind of oddly jealous of them, like she is of Charlotte Bronte. Like, she doesn't want to be a drudge like Charlotte or Anne, but when she realizes that Charlotte wants to be a novelist, she feels really threatened by that because she hasn't thought about creating or writing or her voice being important. But yeah, I think this idea of people following a playbook for their lives and then being disappointed that it doesn't bring them kind of the riches, or that people who made different choices are maybe happier, is something that we still see playing out around us every single day.
Yeah. But you have to have empathy, don't you? I mean, I think you made the point in an article that you wrote about it that I read, which is that she couldn't imagine anything else.
Yeah, it takes a lot to be a revolutionary. Yeah,
she just hasn't got the vision, and you can't really criticize her for that.
Yes, I think that's true of a lot. Is like people like, it's a bigger leap to go to maybe there's not a God than to maybe try and just change religion in a small way, right? So I'm going further back in time and maybe thinking about like a Tudor period or a Jacobean period. Like the revolutionary thought is maybe we should have the Bible in English, not maybe the Bible doesn't matter, right? Like there's moving the goalposts in a different way, and yeah, kind of going into the arguments of the time. And of course, there will always be people who are way ahead of their time and have outlandish ideas, but then I don't know if they're always the best main characters. I think that they're sometimes better to be the kind of side characters, because then you can explore how they're utterly ignored in the time period.
Yeah. Yeah, otherwise it's a bit like you said before, it's a bit too much on the nose, isn't it? If you've just got someone sort of striding around going, I think we're going to prove that the world is round, and everyone else is like, you know, it's too much of a kind of in-joke.
Yeah, unless it actually is a time traveler, right? So I'm not against time travel books. There's one I love, which my friend Kathleen Flynn wrote. It's the Jane Austen Project, which is about someone traveling back in time to save Jane Austen before she dies. And there you can do it, because you can have a character who does have, in fact, it's not even just modern sensibilities. That's a character from our future. But you kind of have them as the outsider seeing the world. It's the kind of having the adventurer, the traveler. In fantasy novels, they do this a lot with a quest where someone's going to a new place, and you can use them as the stand-in who doesn't understand the magic or the world. But readers are quite smart, and they're clued into what's happening. And if you do it even too heavy-handed there, they're not going to like it.
Yeah, I think that happens in Gothic fiction as well. I mean, you know, my novel, The Last to Know, probably the most Gothic sort of element of it, apart from the big spooky house, is the fact that the main character is, you know, an outsider in this community. She becomes, you know, she just becomes more and more and more isolated. And she is, like you say, in a fantasy novel, she could be that person that goes to a completely different world and she sees it with her outside eyes. Or in my sort of, you know, contemporary Gothic novel, she's an outsider who goes into this, you know, slightly strange community and sees it with different eyes. It's the same role, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one other thing, we haven't mentioned your police officer character, and I was really interested in her as well, because she is another point of view character in the book, and she is from the area, so she's an insider. She knows everything about everyone, but because she's a police officer, she kind of has to put up the barriers, especially when she is investigating crimes or potential crimes. So that's kind of interesting, the insider who also has elements of the outsider there.
Yeah, well, actually, funny enough, you just mentioned, you know, you were just mentioning Lydia, and I think there's some parallels with her and Ellie. The police officer is called Ellie, and she's someone who is, you know, she's kind of given her life to this community. I don't give her exact age, but she's going through the menopause, so she's of that, you know, she's of that sort of age, and basically her local police station is going to be closed down for, you know, cost cutting, and she's going to essentially lose her job. And so she's sort of facing this very abrupt end of her career, and the feeling that she's a bit like Lydia, that she's done all of this, she's jumped through everyone's hoops, she's done the things that she was expected to do, and she's got that kind of like, okay, well, is this it? Is this how I get, you know, treated kind of feeling? So she's very frustrated, and it's quite, in some ways, it's quite a sort of typical crime fiction setup, in that, you know, the detective who is kind of coming towards the end of their career, but they've got this one last case that they never solved, that she's driven, you know, which is quite, you know, is quite a tropey sort of idea. But, you know, you just, I suppose, as a writer, you just try and play with it a little bit, and you just try and make those, you know, make her life seem a little bit different. You know, I just wanted to have a different perspective. I wanted to write about a woman who was, having her menopause, and she's, you know, she's sort of doing her job while also dealing with the hot flashes and all this kind of stuff. You know, I was
and that's interesting. It's interesting that you link her to Lydia, because I do think that with both Ellie and Lydia, they're women of a certain age, they're menopausal, and in both cases, they're also dealing with the aging of parents. So at the start of my novel, Lydia's mother has just died and her father is going senile and dies in the course of the novel. Ellie is also caring for her father, who has dementia as well. And so women of that age as being really squeezed from all sides. In Lydia's case, as a parent, in Ellie's case, she doesn't have children. It's also that period where women can be most invisible. Ellie's feeling forced out of her job, but you also have the burdens from the generations that came before and caring for them and finding yourself kind of unmoored when you lose that parental guidance for yourself. Yeah, I think it's such an interesting period. And so often in historical fiction, the heroines are like 21, 22, and we kind of see them, you know, having the happy ending and ending up with the guy and getting married. But there's a lot that's going to happen after that. And what happens at this period when your children are moving on and you feel yourself crushed with all these different pressures, but no longer the exciting and young one with your whole life before you.
Yeah, exactly. And if you do sort of raise up, you know, motherhood, family and motherhood as being the sort of the thing that you put up on the pedestal, that is the everything, then once you've sort of got over that, you do then obviously have this question of like, well, what then? I mean, it has that has to be the case. Even for someone like Ellie, who hasn't had, in my book, who hasn't had children, but she's still, somehow the trajectory is still the same. And I think middle-aged women are I think it's a brilliant sort of material to kind of dig into for novelists, because the stakes are so high. You know, if things go wrong at that age, you're kind of on your last chances. You know, she knows on a practical level that losing her job now at the age, I guess she's probably 55-ish, she's probably not going to get another career sort of job. And similarly, you know, if it's a lot of sort of, you know, domestic suspense like that I write, you know, a lot of it revolves around middle-aged women and marriages. And, you know, when your marriage falls apart after 20-something years, it's, you know, the stakes are quite a lot higher than a sort of a teen romance, which is very exciting. And I have all the time in the world for, you know, Twilight, but the stakes are a bit higher once you get to middle age, you know. The
stakes are higher, but you're at an age where you're better at processing. Whereas for teenagers, the stakes just feel incredibly high because everything feels like the world is ending, even though you're very protected. That's super interesting. Of course, the more prosaic thing here is that the readers of fiction are people who fall into this demographic as well. So middle-aged women are the primary buyers of fiction. So I think it's amazing for people to find themselves represented there and not always be reading about debutantes in their first season who are being, you know, swooning over dukes, or what a lot of historical fiction gives us.
And those stories are really important as well, because, you know, those early romances are the things that form us, you know, they shape us and they're so powerful. So I'm not saying that they're not, you know, really important, but I do think it's just interesting to see the different perspectives. And I think that's why I enjoyed, and Ellie, just kind of this character, Sergeant Ellie, she just inserted herself into the book really, because she wasn't there when I planned it out. It was just being told from Rose's point of view. And then one day I sat down and I wrote basically the what is kind of a prologue. So it's Ellie watching this house on the hill. Actually, the front cover gets the house so perfectly. She's standing there watching the house burning. That's not a big spoiler because it's literally the prologue. She's just standing there watching this house like on fire on top of this hill. And I just sat down and started writing it one day, and I didn't even know who the character was, but I could just kind of see out from her eyes, you know. And I, you know, thinking about it logically, I was thinking the only person that could really be there watching this is a police officer. And so there she was. She was kind of born into the novel, and I just started writing, you know, interspersing chapters from her, and her whole story just kind of came.
Well, it felt really natural. She didn't feel like a last-minute addition, which is great. Okay.
Good, isn't it?
We have been talking well over an hour, so I think we should probably wrap it up. Thank you to everyone who stuck with us. Tracy, there are so many comments from you. I'm going to have to go back through. I'm sure we'll both be in the comments afterwards. And if you're watching this on catch up, please do keep commenting, because Joe and I will respond there to any other questions. Joe, any closing thoughts as we wrap this up?
No, only that it's been absolutely lovely to talk to you. I've been, you know, looking forward to this for a couple of weeks and scribbling down so many questions and things that I wanted to ask you. So it's brilliant. And thank you to everyone that dropped in. It's lovely to chat with Tracy. Like you say, I'll go back and read through her comments, and I'm very glad to read that you're happy at this point in your life. That's a fabulous comment to read. Yeah, so thank you, and thanks to everyone that's come along.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And you should definitely read The Last to Know and Joe's other books. And of course, closing out with Here's Bronte's Mistress again.
Like Chris. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.